What's going on, guys? Moniz here, and welcome back to another camera comparison. Today, we're comparing the brand new LG G7 ThinQ against the GOAT, the greatest of all time smartphone camera, the Pixel 2. Which one takes the better photos? Well, we're about to find out. So in the first picture, it's outside on a pretty cloudy day, and I wanted to test depth of field. As you can see, the pixel background is a little bit more blurred, but the image in the background is a little bit washed out, making it kind of hard to see the details. The LG G7, on the other hand, has a nice background to it. The greens are nice and plush. You can see the details in the pine cone a lot better, and the shadows look more apparent with the LG G7. Now, when you take the exact same photo with HDR on, the Pixel 2 looks significantly different. It's a lot more pleasing. I think the background is a little bit more balanced compared to before. However, I still think the LG G7 looks a little bit better. You can see the details in the wood a little bit more clear. I love the brownish hues that it's picking up from HDR that it couldn't get before. But I do have to admit there's a little bit more detail in the Pixel 2, especially when you look at the strains going across the wood on the right-hand side. Now we have another outdoor photo, and both smartphones did a fantastic job. I think they both look great. Now, the biggest differences is basically the chairs in the photo. The LG G7 tends to make the photo slightly cooler, whereas the Pixel 2 leans towards a more warmer tone. I like the way the G7 looks better. I like the way it used the highlights on the front of the chair. You see them a lot more, whereas on the Pixel 2, they're not too apparent. But there is more detail on the front of the photo with the Pixel 2. You can see the individual lines a little bit more clearly on the Pixel 2 compared to the G7. The background, both of them do a good job with the greens. There's highlights rolling off the leaves, and the sky is pretty much equal. The big difference, though, is that when you look at the car, you can see a lot more detail with the G7. If you look at the wheel itself, you can see between the spokes. And there's also a highlight running horizontally on the car, which is apparent on the G7, but you can't see it on the Pixel 2. Now, here's the exact same photo with HDR on, and the Pixel 2 looks completely different. That blue you saw in the previous photo is no longer a greenish turquoise. It actually looks blue now. It's pretty close to the LG G7, but the LG G7 is a little bit brighter. I do like the shadows better on the Pixel 2. You can see them better underneath the chair, whereas on the G7, they're kind of missing. You also now see that line running across the side of the car on the Pixel 2, which you couldn't see before. So HDR definitely makes a big difference, but I personally think the LG G7 still looks slightly better. In the next two photos, I want to showcase HDR. This is without HDR on first, and I want to show you how these smartphones take the image. With the Pixel 2, again, you're getting a slightly warmer tone or feel to the image itself, whereas with the LG G7, it's slightly more balanced, maybe slightly more towards the cooler side. The highlights are kind of blown out in both pictures, but I think they're slightly more blown out with the G7. You can see that in the sky and around the leaves. However, there is more detail with the G7. You can see those individual leaves a lot better. If you look at the waterfall or the rocks where the waterfall comes down, the image is a lot sharper and a lot more clear on the G7, where it looks a little bit muddy on the Pixel 2. But once you turn on HDR, that's where things completely change. The Pixel 2 is now nice and sharp. You can actually see the blue sky. The exposure has been toned down, and the leaves themselves are a lot more noticeable in both pictures. Now, for some reason, the G7 went too far to the warmer side. I think it's a little bit too green and a little bit too yellow, but the picture is still nicer than it was before. In this photo, we're taking it indoors, and this is a mason jar sitting on my kitchen table with decent lighting. Both phones are pretty much equal. You're not going to say one is significantly better than the other. There are a couple of minor details. First and foremost, there's a bit more noise with the Pixel 2. It's bumping up that ISO, where the LG G7 has a slightly higher aperture and is using slightly more over sharpening. But you do get more detail in the shadows with the Pixel 2, but overall a pretty equal photo. Now look at the difference when you turn HDR on. They both get this nice, beautiful contrast that just saturates the colors, making things look a lot more pleasing. I do think the G7 is a little bit more crystal clear in this picture. Again, you still have a little bit of noise with the Pixel 2, but again, shadows on the Pixel 2 are slightly better, but overall I think the G7 took a better photo. So we're back outside now, and I wanted to test out how both phones handle shadows. As you can see here, the Pixel 2 does a better job with the shadows. They look a lot more clear. There's a little bit more sharpening, making it a lot more visible compared to the G7. But you also notice the difference in the way both of these phones handle color temperatures. Again, the Pixel 2 slightly warmer, whereas the G7 leans towards a cooler tone. Both photos are very pleasing, but it just really comes down to whether you prefer a cooler tone on your camera or a slightly warmer one like with the Pixel 2. Moving on to nighttime photos, and you can see the biggest difference right away. The Pixel 2 needs to use a lot more ISO to compensate for a lack of light compared to the pixel binning that the G7 uses in order to get more light in the shot. Now there is a little bit more over sharpening on the G7, and as you can see here again, the Pixel 2 is leaning more towards a warmer tone. I think they're both pretty even. I think the G7 does a better job of picking up the little details, whereas the Pixel 2 gives you a slightly more pleasing, warmer look. Here's another nighttime photo, and I think the G7 completely botched it. I actually took this one a couple of times. It didn't even turn on super bright mode, which it usually does when the setting is too dark. The Pixel 2 definitely looks better. It was able to expose the picture correctly. You can see the Starbucks coffee logo clearly, whereas on the G7, it's kind of blown out. Both phones have a similar amount of ISO, but you can see there's a little bit more over sharpening going on with the G7. I'm gonna give this photo to the Pixel 2. In this photo, we have a nighttime selfie. And as you can see on the Pixel 2, my skin is a lot clearer. You can see my beard better. It's slightly more sharpened. Both photos have pretty much similar amount of ISO, but I think the Pixel 2 looks slightly more visually appealing. With the G7, my skin tone is way too yellow. It's definitely taking the influence from the light inside the house a little too extremely and doesn't do a good job of exposing the photo overall. Now there's no front-facing camera comparison in this video just because I did a huge front-facing camera comparison in a separate one. If you're interested in seeing that, I'll place a link in the description down below. Now, before I talk about video, this is portrait mode from both cameras, where basically it takes a picture of the subject and artificially blurs the background. Pixel 2 did a better job. I like the blur of the background slightly better. It doesn't look as fake as it does on the G7. It also did a better job overall of blurring the background entirely, whereas on the G7 there's missing portions. The skin tones are a lot more accurate with the Pixel 2, whereas on the G7 it looks slightly overexposed on the forehead, and you don't see the little lines and contours that are on my daughter's face. And last up, we have 4K video. As you can see here, there's no optical image stabilization at 4K with the G7, so the Pixel 2 does a much better job of stabilizing the footage. However, I do think the video itself looks a lot nicer on the G7. You see more details, the colors are more punchy, offering a more appealing look. So that pretty much wraps up my camera comparison between the LG G7 and the Pixel 2. I think they're both pretty even. There were instances where the G7 just did a little bit better, and there were instances where the Pixel 2 came out ahead. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you think the Pixel 2 was better than the G7? Which one would you choose and why? If you want to see more images from these cameras, follow me on Instagram. I'm also doing a blind camera test for the OnePlus 6 right now for the next 6 days, which is only happening on Instagram. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next video.